By the end of 1663, there were 22 full-time privateering craft operating out of Port Royal. Sir Charles Lyttelton, the deputy governor and acting governor of Jamaica at this time, could not be expected to end the activities of the privateers. He himself was benefiting from their revenue to the tune of £1,000 in August towards his expenses in Jamaica. However, he would soon tire of the island and would leave for England on May 2, 1664, for a number of reasons. Just as with his predecessor Windsor, personal health would be cited as among the greatest of them. Lyttelton's replacement was Thomas Modiford, an English planter and Speaker of the House of Assembly on the island of Barbados. His loyalties had notably switched sides during the 10-year-long Civil War. He had gone from a cavalier resisting Oliver Cromwell to serving as governor of Barbados under the parliamentarians before finding himself, somewhat awkwardly, back in the service of the reinstated king. It should be noted here that the return of the king would coincide with the area officially receiving its name, Port Royal. Modiford received the commission as governor of Barbados on February 15, 1664, and would arrive over 3 months later on June 4th to assume his duties. He would not come alone, but with 700 planters and their slaves. This would begin a new epoch for the island, and would mark the large-scale introduction of a slavery-based plantation economy in Jamaica. Immediately upon arrival, Modiford took control of the Jamaican government by calling a meeting of the Council of Jamaica and repealing all privateering commissions, as well as culling the council and filling it with his own supporters. Included in this act was his brother, Colonel Sir James Modiford, who became the Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, as well as Governor of the town and castle of Port Royal. However, Thomas Modiford's strong on privateering policy would quickly soften. Barely 2 weeks later, the governor expressed sentiments of cracking down on privateering gradually rather than all at once, with the hope of reducing the privateers to living as planters instead. This would be the first grain of sand in the heap that would turn Port Royal into the privateering capital of the Western Hemisphere. For the next 7 years of his governorship, despite railing against privateering, he would never forbid the bringing of captured Spanish prizes into Port Royal. He allowed letters of marque issued by previous governors to expire, although he would sometimes hunt down any who would continue to operate as pirates. Even if these pirates were captured, they were often pardoned if they were willing to accept his terms. In 1664, an as yet undeclared war would break out between England and Holland that would culminate the following year in the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Modiford used this to his advantage by utilizing it as a pretext to issue privateering commissions against Dutch shipping and settlements in the Caribbean. However, attacks on Dutch holdings would prove to be not as lucrative as those held by the Spanish. Thus, in 1666, he began issuing letters of marque against the Spanish once again. Attacks against Spanish targets from Port Royal would continue into the following year, despite the signing of the Treaty of Madrid, which granted England valuable commercial concessions, something which made the privateers' approach of forced trade unnecessary. However, privateering would not diminish from the region, quite the opposite. It would go on to reach new and consequently unimagined heights. It would also witness the height of Modiford's power, who by 1668 had established a large and powerful privateering force based out of Port Royal. Though already well known around this time among the privateers operating from Port Royal, namely for actions committed under the service of big names such as Christopher Mings and the Dutch corsair Edward Mansvelt, Henry Morgan would truly come into his own after the death of the latter. With Mansveldt's passing in 1666, Morgan, then his vice-admiral, would assume his authority and become admiral of his privateering fleet. In 1667, diplomatic relations between England and Spain were breaking down. Rumors circulated in Jamaica about an impending Spanish invasion of the island. Between January and February 1668, Modiford commissioned Morgan to, quote, draw together the English privateers and take prisoners of the Spanish, whereby he might inform of the intentions of that enemy to invade Jamaica. While initially intending to attack Havana, Morgan would reconsider and instead attack the inland town of Puerto Principe in 1668. The bounty from the sacking of the city would be minuscule, however, and would cause such discontent in Morgan's ranks that it would even lead to violence between the English and French privateers. Morgan would use the attack to justify his commission by claiming that forces were being assembled from there as well as Vera Cruz to attack Jamaica. Months after Puerto Principe, Morgan would set his sights on Portobello, then the third largest and strongest in the Spanish Main, defended by 3 heavily armed castles. Before this, 200 French privateers among his fleet, disgruntled by the lack of treasure from Puerto Principe, as well as the murder of one of their own, would abandon Morgan and head for Tortuga. Morgan, meanwhile, would continue towards Portobello. His men would make an amphibious landing further down the coast via canoe and captured all 3 castles. The privateers occupied the city for a month and would repulse an attempt to retake it, causing the president of Panama to pay 100,000 pesos to ransom the city. Morgan returned to Port Royal with between 70,000 and 100,000 pounds. This, at the time, was more than the agricultural output of Jamaica. Each privateer received 120 pounds, equivalent to 5 or 6 times the average annual earnings of a sailor. As for Morgan and Modiford, the former received a 5% share for his gains, while the latter received 10%. Though Morgan had overstepped the limits of his commission, in England he was widely regarded as a national hero, and neither he nor Modiford were censured for their actions. Not yet satisfied, Morgan would set his sights as high as the Spanish settlement of Cartagena de Indias, the richest and most important city on the Spanish Main and the crown jewel of the Spanish Empire. He would be joined in December by the English naval frigate Oxford, which was sent by Modiford to aid in his newest and most perilous endeavor. Morgan made it his flagship. While he was hosting a council of war aboard the Oxford, a spark would go off from the ship's powder magazine, setting off a massive explosion that would destroy the ship and kill over 200 of its sailors. By sheer luck of where he was seated, Morgan survived the blast, but was blown into the water. The loss of Oxford left him unable to attack Cartagena. He instead settled for attacking the towns of Maracaibo and Gibraltar in Venezuela. He would bypass the undefended port and raid the equally undefended town of Maracaibo. Though Gibraltar would put up a fight, he would invade it from land and spend 5 weeks plundering it. A Spanish defense squadron would attempt to stop him, but damage to a number of its ships, as well as some genius maneuvers by Morgan, would see him make off for Port Royal with over 250,000 pesos worth of money and possessions. In 1669, Mariana, the Queen Regent of Spain, would authorize attacks on English shipping in the Caribbean. This would lead to a Spanish attack against the northern shores of Jamaica in June 1670, resulting in several houses being set aflame and some of the inhabitants being killed. In response, on July 2nd, Modiford commissioned Morgan, quote, to do and perform all manner of exploits which may tend to the preservation and quiet of this island. Morgan set out and began prowling the waters off of Cuba and the Spanish Main. He planned to gain intelligence from their defenses with which to formulate a strategy. By August of that year, rumors abounded on the streets of Port Royal of the attack that was soon to be unleashed from its waters. Then in December, Morgan set sail for the Spanish Main with an impressive array of over 30 English and French ships, carrying a force of some 1,800 privateers, the largest privateering force ever seen in the Caribbean. Little did they know, however, that by this time the Treaty of Madrid had been signed just 5 months earlier between England and Spain, meant to end the Second Anglo-Spanish War and settle all disputes in the Americas. A new one was soon to break out. Under the treaty, all acts of reprisal by Spain were revoked, and England's holdings in the Caribbean, namely Jamaica, were officially recognized. The latter concession was particularly something Modiford had been striving for in his constant approval of privateering. Despite this, he would fail to inform Morgan of the treaty's signing in time. Morgan's assault was aimed at the Spanish Main, at Old Panama City on Panama's southern coast. For this, the privateers would have to conduct an overland invasion. They first moved to secure various strategic points. Morgan would seize the islands of Old Providence and Santa Catalina off the coast of Colombia. A small garrison would be left behind on Santa Catalina while a forward force would sail south for Panama. It would arrive 4 days later and assault the walls of the mountainous Fort Lorenzo at the mouth of the Rio Chagres. After sustaining heavy losses, they would take the fort and raise the English flag for Morgan's arrival several days later. The force of now 1,400 privateers would navigate up the Rio Chagres, and over a week later would arrive at its destination. They would deliver a heavy defeat against a numerically superior Spanish force before the walls of Panama City. The city itself would then be entered and sacked. Though Governor Modiford reported their gains at the time as 30,000 pounds, in truth, the privateers had departed with between 140,000 and 400,000 pesos worth of treasure, an absolutely massive haul. However, the individual pay for the privateers was comparatively negligible, and Morgan set off for Port Royal ahead of most of his fleet, presumed by some to have left with the bulk of the treasure. He would return to Port Royal to the praise of many. However, the reception of the news of what had happened at Panama would receive a very different welcome in Europe. The flames of Panama, so soon after the signing of the treaty, led to an international crisis between England and Spain. The English government heard rumors from their ambassadors in Europe that the Spanish were contemplating another war. Hoping to appease their newfound friends, and quickly at that, Charles II and his Secretary of State, the Earl of Arlington, ordered Morgan's arrest, as well as that of his enabler, Governor Modiford. A new governor, Thomas Lynch, was sent out to execute the order and to take Modiford's place, the latter having had his authority revoked by the king. Perhaps here it would be wise to look at the consequences of Modiford's privateering policy. Though the privateers were able to gain high amounts of income, the official revenue for the accounts related to the English crown was negligible at best, with the crown even receiving no revenue whatsoever between 1668 and 1671. Not only did the king not seem to be getting his due share of the loot, there was a growing pushback against the practice itself. The creation of plantations in the parishes that had first been divided up under Modiford's governorship had created a powerful planter class. Outside and on the edges of life in Port Royal, the planter and merchant population were increasingly more in favor of peaceful trade with Spain. They hated that privateering constantly siphoned away at their labor force. The most outstanding of these opponents to Modiford's policies was a man named John Style, who had come to Jamaica in 1665 and owned land in the St. John parish. He was very vocal in his attacks against privateering, so much so that he would even be fined £500 by Modiford and was even imprisoned, quote, for his words. Being released in June 1671, he would find a growing number of islanders in favor of removing Modiford from office and reversing his policies. He would not have to act, however. Though Thomas Lynch would have an interesting time arresting Modiford, initially suffering from a case of gout and trying to gauge the sentiments of the island, he would eventually learn of the placing of Modiford's son in the Tower of London. This would encourage him to act. He would arrest the former governor and send him on his way to London. Lynch would then set about issuing pardons to those privateers who came forward in Port Royal. This policy would prove so effective that by December of 1671, few active privateer-turned-pirate crews were still out and about. Lynch's position was soon strong enough that he was able to arrest Henry Morgan himself and send him back to London as a prisoner. From this point on, overt acts of piracy would decline in Port Royal. Though Lynch had few forces at his disposal, he would work alongside Spanish authorities to hunt down those pirate crews that remained on the run. Many of the latter would choose to operate under more clandestine means, disguising their actions and hiding their intentions. They would, however, receive secret aid from Henry Morgan. Morgan had returned to London as a prisoner in April 1672, only to be welcomed as a hero. Many in England had heard of his exploits in the Caribbean and lionized him as the second coming of Sir Francis Drake, the latter having likewise terrorized the Spanish under the privateering commission of Queen Elizabeth I almost a century earlier. No charges were ever pressed against Morgan, having given evidence to the lords of trade and plantations that he had no knowledge of the Treaty of Madrid prior to his invasion of Panama. Morgan would even be made into a knight bachelor by the king in November 1674. Just 2 months later, he would be sent back to Jamaica with John Vaughan, 3rd Earl of Carbery, the latter having been made the island's new governor after the king had grown unhappy with Lynch's conduct. Morgan returned to the island as Carbery's deputy, earning the title of Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. The former governor, Thomas Modiford, would be released from the Tower of London without charge. He would likewise accompany them to Jamaica as the island's new Chief Justice. The group arrived in Jamaica in March of 1675. At this time, Port Royal was the preferred destination for at least 1,200 pirates. Here, the governor of Jamaica would quickly find himself increasingly opposed against his deputy. Whereas Lord Carbery had been sent to eradicate the last vestiges of piracy in Port Royal, Morgan, who had been given the same duty, continued to foster friendly relations with them. The rivalry between the two came with minor quarrels, such as when Carbery demanded Morgan vacate the king's house, which was usually reserved as the governor's residence. However, their primary contention lay over Morgan's private support for privateering, which Carbery made mention of in his letters back to England. Carbery even accused him and his brother-in-law, Robert Binloss, of directing privateers to get letters of marque from the French governor at Tortuga. so as to get around English restrictions, an act for which the two of them received payment in return. Things would eventually come to a head between the two when, on July 1676, Carberry called a hearing of the Council of Jamaica, where, before the 12-man assembly, he would bring charges against Morgan and Binloss. Though much correspondence would pass between England and Jamaica, Carberry's attempt at accusing the two would prove unsuccessful, and he would be recalled to England 2 years later. Morgan remained governor for 3 months. During this time, France was turning into a growing threat in the Caribbean. Morgan took control of the defense of Port Royal. He declared martial law because of the threat of invasion, rebuilt the fortifications surrounding the town, and began increasing the number of cannons defending the city. Charles Howard, 1st Earl of Carlisle, would arrive as the new governor in July 1678. Though Carberry warned Carlisle to strip Morgan of all his offices, the new governor would do no such thing. Morgan would remain in his position even as Carlisle began pivoting from his predecessor's anti-piracy stance. He began reverting back to relying on privateers for protection once again, mostly due to the growing threat of France and Port Royal's need of stronger naval defenses. As Carlisle would return to England in May 1680, Morgan would be left once again as the acting governor of Jamaica. This would mark a new epoch in his legacy on the island, as he would gain a greater resolve to combat piracy and privateering. Alongside the Jamaican Assembly, he would begin cracking down on such activities, hunting down, trying, convicting, and executing pirates. This anti-piracy campaign would prove so effective that by the time of a certain Thomas Lynch's return to the island to serve a second term as governor 2 years later, he would find that large-scale piracy and privateering had been virtually eradicated. It is believed that Morgan's newfound resoluteness reflected the general change in attitudes towards the practice in Jamaica. By then, the island was coming to rely more and more on the revenue from her sugar exports from her plantations, a trade which was regularly threatened by the opportunism of Port Royal's maritime marauders. Owning a few plantations himself, which he had invested into via his pirating fortunes, ironically enough, Morgan saw the necessity of getting rid of those he may once have called brothers-in-arms. The next few years, however, would see pirating take on various forms, as European powers would set forth to stomp it out. Never again would privateering have the same widespread influence as it did under the governorship of the likes of Modiford or Carlisle. In time, the nascent colonies in the New World began to gain legitimate naval forces from their respective home countries, eroding the need to rely on pirates for protection. The presence of these same forces in the Caribbean would have likewise made the existence of significant numbers of pirates extremely difficult. They would be forced more and more to the fringes of the region, relying on more uninhabited locales such as the islands of the Bahamas to the north. There, pirates and privateers would form a stronghold at Charlestown, modern-day Nassau, on the island of New Providence, which would set the foundation for the island's future as a pirates' republic. For Port Royal, however, its heyday of piracy was at an end. As it would turn out, so was its lieutenant governor's political career. Though it is ironically fitting that one of privateering's biggest supporters would turn into its greatest detractor, Morgan would, with an equal irony, finally be undermined for a crime that he did not even commit. His secretary had forged his signature on a proclamation that allowed Jamaican officials to act against interlopers intruding on the Royal African Company's monopoly, that monopoly being of slaves who were traded to the island. This ran against the laws already present in the colony. Two former governors that were by then well acquainted with Morgan, Carberry and Lynch, would also begin fostering criticism against him in London. After Lynch had secured a payment to the king of some £50,000, Morgan would be stripped of his positions and leave Lynch as the island's new governor. Already a heavy drinker, Morgan took out his frustrations about his tarnished reputation and the news of his lost authority on the bottle. His increasing reliance on alcohol would work against his health. Morgan would pass away on August 25, 1688, leaving behind a long and mixed legacy, from a national hero and privateer extraordinaire to a criminal and marauder of the high seas, from a cutthroat who supported the systemized subjugation of African slaves to a reformer of law and a defender of peace and trade. In the wake of his death, an amnesty would be declared, wherein pirates and privateers were free to pay their respects to Morgan alongside law-abiding citizens, all of which was without fear of arrest. It was surely a mixed display of conflicting emotions for those coming to pay their respects, those to whom, at one time or another, he had acted in favor of, and also worked against. Morgan would be buried in the Palisado Cemetery in Port Royal, to the tune of a 22-gun salute from the ships anchored nearby. With his passing, the countdown would begin for a new era in Port Royal's history, one whose occurrence would take the memory of its glory days and drown them in the waters of both eschatological and geological damnation.